This is the model for the church in central Lviv for the apostles Peter and Paul, and that's what it would look like normally, but it is currently going under renovations. And in the nearly 2 months that I have been here, every single day, and sometimes several times a day, there is a memorial service here for somebody's son or brother or husband who has died in combat in this war. And the body will be taken up to the main hall, or the main cemetery in Lviv, and it will be put to rest, that body, in the section reserved for the honored dead. You know, it is said so many times that it is almost cliche to say it, but the price of freedom is not free. And if it were anywhere other than Ukraine, I would say that was trite. But these people are fighting for their freedom, and they will continue to do so. But they are also painfully aware that there is a very high cost to be paid. This part of this massive graveyard under the Ukrainian flag is this section of the cemetery. These are more established graves, graves that go back farther than the current wave of this war. Of course, the Ukrainians consider this all one war. It started in 2014 for them. But these graves are here for men who died since the invasion of Donbass. And you'll notice they all have, or many of them have, nom de guerre. So there is artist. This guy ironically called Tiny. But just the cost on this country since the beginning of the Russian invasion in the post-Maidan period. There's Dnipro, this guy's nom de guerre. His kids' nom de guerre. Now keeping in mind that each and every one of these graves has a story to tell. And we should keep that in mind. I want to bring attention to this grave. Vasily Slipak. Vasily has an interesting story because he had a good life outside of Ukraine. He was an opera singer in Paris. He didn't have to come back. He had a really prestigious career. But he came back to fight for his country. And I find that admirable. Vasily Slipak. As I said, this cemetery is enormous, and I'm actually standing in what is considered the Polish section. And that's because at one point Lviv was actually part of Poland. Many of the graves behind me are of Polish soldiers who died fighting a war roughly about a century ago. It was against an expansionist USSR. When Vladimir Lenin came to power in Moscow, one of the first things that he decided he would do in order to spread his communist revolution was to reconquer Ukraine, which had, in one of its brief moments in history, declared itself independent. Lenin wanted to reconquer Ukraine and then push into Poland and make them all part of the Soviet Union. He was stopped by the Poles pretty much in this region. It was a humiliating defeat for Russia and the USSR. And, in this current war, there are those who say that it is simply a proxy war being fought against Russia by NATO and America. Even Secretary of Defense Austin, after his meeting in Kiev with President Vladimir Zelensky, openly did say that they hoped to diminish Russia's capacity through this war. Those critics will say that by fighting a proxy war, the West is willing to strike at Russia until the very last Ukrainian life is spent. Well, I'm not that cynical, but that argument could be made. However, there's an important distinction here, and it's worth noting that unlike that war oh so many years ago, this time, at the end of this war, there will be a Ukraine. This land will not be annexed by Poland, and it will not be a satellite state of Russia. It will, once and for all, finally come into its own and be its own country. And so Ukrainians know that. And they are willing to fight as hard as they can because, at the end of the day, there will be a country called Ukraine. But there's another thing that is worth noting that is similar to that war that happened about a century ago, about 100 years ago, and it is this. Many of you may have seen that recently Ukraine created a foreign legion, and notably the four-time New York Times bestseller, national security analyst and former naval intelligence officer Malcolm Nance joined that legion. Well, that is not the first time in this country's history that has happened. These graves behind me here are of three Americans who came to this land all those years ago because they saw the threat of an expansionist Russia and Vladimir Lenin's Bolshevik Revolution, and they decided to come here and pay the ultimate price to make sure that it was stopped. And like the Legion today, or those of us who are here because we see the threat to freedom of speech that Putin's autocratic kleptocracy presents, we, like these pilots who died in that war, know that the threat from Putin goes well beyond the Ukrainian borders. And these are the three men who came in that bygone era to fight for freedom against that aggression. Edmund Graves from Boston. Arthur Kelly from Virginia. And as a proud Michigander, it is with honor that I say Captain McCollum from Detroit. This is not part of the cemetery proper. This is called the Field of Mars, named after the Roman god of war. It's actually adjacent to that enormous cemetery. As you can see there, the wall to the cemetery itself and the graves beyond it. But sadly, in another example of the cost of this current conflict, because they bury their war dead in an honored space, and that space within the cemetery itself is now full. They have begun to bury the war dead in this current conflict here in this field, where there's an honored space that can be made for them. Notice the size of this field. That is the cost that Russia is making Ukraine pay.
It's very awful to see the dead bodies. They came here, and for me personally, I feel horrible about that. But I understand that we have to help the families to bury their heroes, and we buried that heroes in the Lychakiv cemetery in the field of burials honor.
What is the cost that they pay for Ukrainian freedom?
They lost their families, they lost their fathers, brothers, and it's very awful to see that. But we understand that's the cost that we pay for our freedom, to freedom for all of us.
God, I wished I'd never have to put this crap on ever again, and I really do hate those who do this in a performative manner. I mean, I'm not physically under threat right now, but every time you put this on, it reminds you you're in a conflict zone, even if you're just testing it to see if it fits you. And I wanted to make this point. I guess I could have waited for an air raid siren or something, but I can't depend on that, and I need to get this video published. So there's another cost to war, and it is far less quantitative. It's far less definitive. It's more ephemeral, and it is this. You know, every time I put this on, or when I walk around the streets and I see refugees, or, you know, we are under threat of attack, it does cause you harm psychologically. There is a cost there that gets paid. And sometimes it doesn't manifest itself for days, sometimes weeks, maybe even years, or even generationally, really. But it's a cost as well. And I'm filming this on my 52nd birthday. And I'd hope to never spend another birthday in a war zone, away from my friends and my family, but I was kind of in a catch-22. I could either sit at home and watch from afar or come here. Either way, there was going to be a cost to me. But I'm filming this on my birthday, but also because in a couple of days it's going to be World International Press Freedom Day. And I wanted to draw attention to those of us who come here and pay the ultimate cost. And it's not the same as what the Ukrainians are paying. I want to emphasize that. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we choose to be here, even if we do have that catch-22 scenario. It's not the same, but it is a cost. And as many of you know, I lost a friend recently who was here covering this war. So I wanted to wrap this up. I thought it was only right to wrap this up with those of us who come here and pay a different kind of cost, or to also just mention that there is a cost that is psychological, not physical, but there are those who come here and pay the ultimate cost. And to finish this log off, I thought I would pay tribute to them.
After a while, the battle will be over. For that day when we shall lay down our burden and study war no more. Finally, brethren, after a while, the battle will be over. For that day when we shall lay down our burden and study war no more. Finally, brethren, after a while, the battle will be over. For that day when we shall lay down